Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. We are on Facebook and Twitter and on the web, and you can find all by searching for A2Z History page. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. We're also back on Patreon in a big way, and you can find us by searching on Patreon for the History of the Papacy podcast or by following the link in the show notes or the description below. There are many great benefits to becoming a patron. You can be in the exclusive club, which is the History of the Papacy Diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are a list of bishops that are commemorated during the Mass or liturgy. Not only will you be on this exclusive History of the Papacy Diptychs, you will get a bonus feed of the podcast where you will receive all new episodes ad-free and early. You will also get the exclusive audio of our new YouTube-only History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes series. Your support is huge in keeping this whole operation going. Now, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. To start off, I would love to thank the latest members to our History of the Papacy Diptychs, Jose and Timothy at the Antioch levels. Thank you so much, Jose and Timothy, for joining the History of the Papacy on Patreon, and you too can join this elusive club and exclusive club at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. And now let us commemorate the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Joran and William at the Alexandria level and Paul the Magnificent at Constantinople. Now in today's episode, I'm joined by Terry Young of the History of the Early Church podcast. We discuss one of the most fascinating aspects of Christian history, that of the martyrs. Who were the early Christian martyrs? Why did they act the way they did? Were the tales of martyrdom accurate or overblown? We will address all of those issues and much more in this two-part special. I hope you enjoy, and I will talk to you next time. Welcome back to another collaboration between the History of the Early Church and the History of the Papacy podcasts. Today, I am, of course, joined by Terry. Terry, how are you?
I'm doing good, Steve. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. We're going to talk about martyrdom, especially martyrdom in the early Christian context. Before we get going too far, though, Terry, why don't you tell us a little bit about your show?
Sure. So my podcast, The History of the Early Church, is a detailed narrative history podcast of the early church from the beginning, and plan is to go up to the middle of the 5th century. And right now we have just finished in our narrative our coverage of the Great Persecution, the persecution of Diocletian that occurred in the early 4th century, right before and even during the conversion of Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor. So this actually ties in very well, because with this we've kind of just reached the end of this era, the era of the persecutions and martyrs, to a certain extent. And so we're at that fulcrum in the narrative. So it's a very, very exciting. And I think there'll be a lot of things we'll hit on in this episode that will tie into things that I've covered in the past few episodes.
Yeah, it's definitely perfect timing for that. And it's kind of a subsection of what was going on at a really exciting time in Christian history.
Yes, yes.
Let's start off with a quick overview of what is the context of martyrdom we're talking about today.
So the context we're talking about is the persecution and martyrdom of Christians in the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries AD. So that everything from begins in the mid-1st century, most famously with persecution in Nero, up until the Roman Empire begins its transition away from paganism to Christianity with the figure of Constantine. So it's a long period with a lot of kind of different subsets and details within it.
Now, we should probably say that what was the character of martyrdom in those first 3 centuries of Christianity? I think in the modern idea, we get the martyr as maybe a violent character, but that's not necessarily how the early Christians would have saw martyrdom.
No, no. And, of course, the starting point for any early Christian discussion of martyrdom is, of course, the figure of Christ himself, who, sort of obviously kind of ultimate non-violent martyr within Christian understanding. You have Christian martyrs who who do somewhat might provoke the authorities or publicly sort of court the imperial magistrates. But that is largely the extent of it. Occasionally, I remember one particularly interesting incident where a young Christian woman was brought before a magistrate, and he ordered her to sacrifice on this altar, make an offering to the gods, and she kicked the altar over. But that's about kind of the most edgy it gets, at least in this period. And then, of course, there are other martyrs who are do not actively seek out martyrdom. It sort of comes and finds them, but they don't resist or fight back. They, again, kind of trying to follow the example of Christ, laying down their life, at least in the accounts that we have.
As well, on top of that, martyrs might not even necessarily be injured in some way. They might lose their job or lose financial or economic status. So we get a lot of kind of the juicier stories are ones where the martyr's been thrown to the lions, but there was also people who just, they would lose their station, or they might be jailed, or they might be outcast.
Right. And in that case, usually the term martyr wouldn't normally be applied, at least by the early Christians. They would use the term confessor.
Yes.
Someone who suffered on behalf of the faith but didn't necessarily give their life, whereas martyr was usually reserved for someone who actually, met their end as a result of their Christian faith.
And we could probably lump all that together under an umbrella term of persecution.
Yes, yes.
So that, we've laid that out a little bit. Not every scholar agrees with that kind of framework. What were maybe some of the legends or some of the critiques of the Christian perspective on early Christian persecution and martyrdom?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the kind of the legend first, because I think what we have here is a good case of you have two views polarized off one another, and neither gets, I think, the real historical picture correct. So there is this popular, really misconception, this legendary notion that from Nero to Constantine, it was just nonstop, top-down governmental persecution of the early church. Completely false. Not that the actual number of times that the Roman government, as a policy, really went after Christians, there's really only, and we'll get into this later, you can count on one hand the actual number of times that happened. And a lot of persecution wasn't often initiated from the top, especially in the early years. And over time, there has the finer details and intricacies of that period have kind of been smoothed over and washed away with this just general age of the martyrs, age of persecution for those early centuries. And the entire period is just kind of painted with a broad brush. And it doesn't help, as we'll get into later, we have lots of literature about early martyrs, and much of it is quite legendary and not particularly helpful for actually trying to reconstruct what happened in those centuries. Now, the view you will find among the kind of other end of the spectrum as far as critics go, and this is a view that kind of recently came to the fore with Candida Moss's book, The Myth of Persecution, is the idea that persecution and martyrdom more or less happened almost never in the early centuries, that most of our information is not reliable or was made up by later Christians, and that the few times where Christians may have actually been killed, they brought it on themselves, and the actual number of martyrs was very, very low. Now, that's not a new view. You actually find this even back with Enlightenment figures like Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in the French philosopher Voltaire. Another kind of part of this is figures like Voltaire would argue that the Romans were really, just like us Enlightenment era secular rationalists, who persecuted for secular, non-religious reasons, and the Christians were the fanatics. So obviously, I think that view is a reaction to the popular, this legendary view that there was just nonstop state persecution for 3 centuries, or even the somewhat less extreme misconception, which is that there were, quote unquote, 10 persecutions, that 10 different emperors initiated 10 empire-wide persecutions, which is also not accurate, but not as inaccurate, I should say. So with the critics, that they are getting at something that is correct. They are pointing out something that is true. But to quote one of my favorite biblical scholars, Michael Heiser, that skeptical view affirms the obvious and then extrapolates to the unnecessary. I would sort of describe it as an overcorrection of the legendary misconceptions. And so I think the historical reality is in between those views and more complicated and therefore much more interesting and nuanced.
Yeah, I think that is, and when you look at the nuanced argument, isn't as it isn't as polarizing, but it oftentimes is more interesting.
Yep, very much so.
Let's talk a little bit about the Roman religion, because that plays a lot into how and why the Romans maybe persecuted or tolerated other faiths. And one of the big things about Roman religion was it was very closely tied with the state, and it was a polyistic religion. So many gods who often they were personified, had human characteristics. The primitive Roman religion was animistic, with household spirits and spirits of nature. There were river spirits and spirits of mountains, things like that. And there was also ancestor worship, plus aspects of ancient Proto-Indo-European religion, such as divination. There was also an adoption of Etruscan religion. So the Romans really did soak up. Oh, they had their own ideas, and then as they interacted with other civilizations, they would absorb parts of their religion, particularly with the Greeks. Some of their worship would seep in through the Magna Graecia part of southern Italy, as well as when the Romans conquered Greece. So as the Romans expanded, they would absorb these gods and traditions, especially things from the East would start to come in, like the mystery cults of Mithras, and Greek gods and Greek cults would come in. There was also an imperial cult of worship of the emperor. Then a little bit later on, a worship of a god Sol Invictus would come in as well. The Romans were not fast to persecute religious minorities, but they also weren't the lovey-dovey tolerant people of religion that sometimes people will say. It was really a matter if people worshiped the gods and did their duties to the gods, then the Romans didn't have a huge problem. It was really when they ran into a people or a tribe who weren't going to participate, particularly in things like the Imperial Cult, that there was problems. Terry, would you say, we can have a little discussion about that, because I'm not sure either. Would you say that the Romans were tolerant?
I think we have to, because when we say religious tolerance, we're referring to a modern theory of religious tolerance that mainly comes from the Enlightenment and what have you. And we need to be careful not to impose that on ancient people, and in this case, the Romans. And I think that's where a term like religious tolerance, which means one thing to us, can be problematic. As you pointed out, the Roman religion was very much tied to the state. The central political theology of the Roman state was the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. If the gods are supplicated with the right worship that is due to them, they will in turn bless the Roman Empire, and it will be prosperous. If the Romans neglect their duty, the gods will withdraw their protection, and barbarians and plague and famine and all these sort of horrible things will come into effect, and the emperor, even the emperor's life, will be at stake. That is the overriding political theology, ideology of the Roman state, and interesting enough, doesn't actually change post-Constantine either. It remains the Roman way of thinking throughout really the empire's whole history. And so, as you said, they had when they conquered other people, they would often absorb their cults. They had no issue with taking on other religious cults or assimilating local deities to their own. The imperial cult often functioned as a kind of centralizing focus for religion, especially in the eastern provinces where ruler cults were, had a long history, with the pharaohs and what have you, in Egypt and the Diadochi and what have you. So the Romans were welcoming so long as your cult sort of fit into that system. Atheism, which again, using a Roman definition, not a modern one, would mean the refusal to pay the gods their due worship and honor, and that was seen as dangerous and subversive.
Yeah, I think, and that's going to lead us to our next point of how Christians fit into this Roman perspective on religion. And you really have to talk about the Jews first before you get into the Christians. The Romans had kind of a strange relationship with the Jews. Even though the Jews wouldn't sacrifice to the Roman gods, the imperial administration saw that the Jewish religion had something going for it, and they kind of gave it a pass for many different reasons that are probably not super important to get into here. But they respected that the Jewish religion was obviously very old, that they had strong traditions. So they made it a legal religion, but exempted it from many of the things that the Second Temple Jews of that period would have had major problems with, such as paying certain taxes or participating in military service or committing idolatry to them by sacrificing to the Roman gods. The Romans weren't endlessly tolerant, though, of the Jews and the Jews' religion and how it intersected with the Roman administration. That's why we see things like the Jerusalem temple being destroyed in 69 CE. A few years later, there was another major revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. But still, Judaism would have some rough patches and then wind up being tolerated again after that. And the Christians coming out of the Second Temple Judaism, it starts to become a stark line. And this is kind of part of the reason how Judaism and Christianity start to split off, is that the early Christians are not seen as a licit religion, and they're being expected to participate in the Roman cult and the imperial cult, even though they don't see themselves as, well, they see themselves as something else, and they're also seeing that sacrificing to Roman gods as idolatry. Now, and that's some of the reasons why Christianity starts to get the microscope turned on it by the Roman authorities. What were some of the things that the Romans expected of someone who was a citizen of their empire? They didn't expect a lot from them religiously, but they did have a few things that, especially, and it wasn't consistent, but at times people would have to do things for the imperial cult. What type of things did the Roman administration expect a citizen to do and to participate in?
Yes. Well, obviously, the local cults were usually, it was expected that people would, in different provinces, would maintain the worship of their local deities, and that would contribute to, again, keeping the gods as a whole happy. The imperial cult was a very good, useful focus, and there's in Pliny the Younger's famous correspondence with the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, actually, I think illustrates this quite well when he's writing to the emperor, and he wasn't sure quite how to deal with Christians. He knew that they should be punished, but he ran into some issues which we don't necessarily have to rabbit trail into here. But the central act would be sacrifice. Now that could be an animal, but it could be pouring out a libation or a pinch of incense in front of a cult image of the emperor or the Roman state gods. But often, especially in the East, it'd be a cult statue of the emperor. Now, from the Roman, the Romans that actually lived in Rome, they themselves didn't necessarily regard living emperors as gods, at least yet. The emperor could be deified after death. But so they were technically, what they were doing is paying homage to the genius, the divine guiding spirit that the emperor had. Now, in the East, obviously, would have been perceived different. But that, it was as much a demonstration of civic and provincial loyalty as anything else, that you're willing to make this offering to the gods or before an image of the emperor. That would be kind of a basic, that would be to them like, to us saluting the flag or venerating some type of symbol of the nation.
This is a good point, I think, because anybody who's a listener of either of our shows or both of our shows, we know pretty early on that non-Jews start becoming Christians, and it kind of puts them in a interesting situation that, okay, so sacrifice, when you look at it at an individual level, if you're pouring a little libation or sprinkling a little incense into a fire, or even killing a little animal, like not even like making a huge spectacle, choosing not to do that can put you in a really bad position if you're a Roman citizen who's maybe of higher rank and that's the demographic.
Yes.
that's starting to become Christian, people who are of a little bit more means. Maybe they're merchants, maybe they're in the civil administration, and they get to the point where you have to do some sort of sacrifice. But like you said, it's not it's hard to say it's not a huge thing, but it's, like you said, it's making just a little veneration towards the state in many cases. But that's something that's at that point, in the way that the Romans are expecting it, not the physical act of it, but the meaning behind that act, is something that's completely antithetical to the Christian belief system. And that's putting these people into a kind of a tough corner to be in.
Yes, and especially for someone of higher status, it's going to be noticeable, especially if they're on maybe the local city council, a decurion, or somebody of some means who would be expected to be leading their fellow citizens in those acts and even sponsoring them. The perception is obviously, and I think this is partly why in the authentic accounts we have of martyrs, why you often see magistrates who are just sort of flabbergasted and frustrated. Why is this such a big deal? And because from their perspective, this is just a very simple act of demonstrating your loyalty to the empire. In the Christian mind, though, what's interesting is that the early Christians, when it comes to the pagan gods, don't always necessarily think of them as non-existent. They often think of them as demons or facades created by demons. So when they will look at a temple and they see sacrifices being made or libations poured out, they view that as people feeding demons, often literally so. That you are sacrifice to a god is sort of the most common historical act of worship in human religion, and obviously the Jewish and Christian insistence that only the Creator is worthy to receive that, and that any other being that would demand worship is an evil entity. So that completely flip side, inverted perspective on cult practice is, I think, it accounts for why it becomes such a why sacrifice is that line in the sand.
Yeah, I think you're making it that's the strong point there it's when you really drill down to it, it's what are the individual choices people make. If you really are a believing Christian and you think that even just throwing a little pinch of incense into the fire is promoting demons, that psychologically of your personal faith and how you're going to be perceived in the different groups that these people existed in. So if you're a magistrate, you're in that group of people who are perceiving you in a certain way and having certain cultural expectations of you. But also in your Christian community, there's certain things that are expected of you. So even if you take away the person's personal beliefs, how they have to fit into the different groups that they fit into and that they have chosen to be into is really going to be a driver of what kind of decision that person's going to make.
Yes, and you see something kind of like that all the way back with in the letters of Paul, where he's talking about not eating meat that may have been sacrificed to idols, and part of the concern there is that other people may see that, and as a result, come away with the impression that it's okay for Christians to partake in idolatrous meals or things like that. So both outside of the early church and within it, because I think Paul mentions other believers who might be weaker in their faith, seeing someone they look up to who is doing a compromising behavior, and they think, oh, okay, well, that means I can use that as a justification for what I'm doing.
Yeah, there was another example I thought of that there was a bishop, I want to say it was in Carthage, who was called to he wouldn't participate in the sacrifice, but he was asked to give up the sacred book. So, but instead of giving them the Gospels, he gave them a copy of a heretical book that he had hanging around.
Yes.
And so that fine line, okay, yeah, he was giving a heretical book, but his critics were like, you gave something up
Right.
and you participated in that. So it's a little different than just purely sacrificing, but it's kind of in that same vein of it's a perspective issue.
That's actually interesting because, yes, the individual you're talking about is Mensurius of Carthage. He was the bishop of Carthage during the Great Persecution. He's I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the Donatist schism. My listeners will be hearing about that very soon. But basically, a very bitter schism in North Africa that resulted after the Great Persecution over precisely that. People that handed over, particularly copies of the scriptures, but even other pieces of church property. And it's interesting that in different parts of the empire, that kind of same action could be perceived differently. So, yeah, some took a really hard line and said, you can't give up anything. You should just basically walk up there and offer yourself up, and don't give even heretical books or property or anything. Don't give any of that up to the government. And then you could contrast that with someone like the Coptic Pope at the time, Peter of Alexandria, who, when he was determining what penances should be given out for Christians who lapsed in the persecution, one of the situations that came up is, what about Christians who bribed officials or gave up their property to officials so they wouldn't have to sacrifice? And Peter, being a more compassionate pastoral type, put the most positive spin on that. He said, you've given up your worldly possessions. You're serving God and not greed. That's a good thing. Versus someone in North Africa might look at that and see the exact same act and view that as compromise.
Yeah, as a cop out of making the hard decision. So it really is. It's kind of a hardliners versus people who were trying to give people a pass, and that was
Yep.
a big issue in that time right after the Great Persecution. Really, not even right after. It took a couple of centuries to iron all of that out.
And North Africa, they never did permanently heal that.
Yeah.
And even earlier, you had a schism during the Decene persecution in the mid-3rd century, which was never healed. And in Egypt, you had the same thing as well with the Meletians. And that's something that kind of ties back into our what we were talking about earlier with the kind of romantic myth of the persecution. And I think part of that is this idea that, well, persecution was just always good for the early church. It just, it made everybody stronger and brought everyone together. And, there is something to that, but often persecution left very deep, bitter wounds that were not healed, and created fractures, schisms within communities that in some cases couldn't recover.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting point, because there's been a lot of modern research into what you might say in quotes cult behavior of groups like the Hare Krishnas and the Moonies, who were a big thing in the 70s and the 80s, and even groups like the Mormons, who they're they use the persecution, and I mean these groups, it wasn't necessarily persecution, but a lot of times it was just negativity against them. In the Mormons' case, there was persecution, but these groups kind of used that to solidify the core and to solidify their connection to each other. In the early Christian context, you had so many different groups who they were in conflict with each other already. And these groups might have used persecution to winnow themselves down and to make their base, so to speak, in another modern parlance, to make them more cohesive. But you also had people like certain popes in the Alexandrian church in Egypt who wanted more universality. So in that case, the persecution really did, it was starting to slice off marginal people who were marginal to the faith. That was one of the issues, and we'll get into this probably a little bit later, but as Christianity, after the Decian persecution and about the 50-ish years until the persecution of Diocletian, there was a huge growth in Christianity amongst people of the higher classes and of people who had no connection to the Jewish faith whatsoever, but they're seeing that, hey, this Christianity thing, I like the faith aspect of it, but it's also putting me in connection with other people who I can maybe grow with financially or grow with, and more power in the community. So those people their connection to the faith is marginal at best, and those were the people who were really open to being drawn off with some persecution.
Yep. And we will definitely get into that, because that period is actually a very crucial part of kind of correcting the historical misconceptions. I think in a lot of cases it boils down to competing visions of what the Christian church is. You have those like groups like the Dantes and the Novatians and the Meletians, who see the church as something that needs to be pure. It is a city on the hill, and its numbers are very small, and it is very exclusive. I think even the Novatians called themselves the Church of the Pure, if I'm remembering correctly. And then you have the other view, which is the church is a hospital for sinners, and you are going to have a mix of people in it. And so that tension between those two wings is a consistent theme in early Christianity.
Yeah, and I think one last thing that's probably worth mentioning before we dive into the main section of some of these different frameworks of how we can, in the historiography of martyrdom, is that there's been some study of why people make certain decisions, especially decisions that might be seen as irrational, like putting yourself in harm's way and even your family into harm's way for your religion might be seen as an irrational decision. A lot has been written about this in game theory, which is a philosophical and economic approach to how people make decisions. And we can probably put some links to some different things, but there's a thing called the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, and some people have wrote something called the martyr's dilemma, and they really drill into how people can make individual decisions that may seem irrational from the outside, but when you drill into the different factors of why they make the decision, then it seems that it's a completely rational decision. And martyrdom, in the Christian context, or even one of the articles that I read was about why somebody might make a decision like in war to jump on a hand grenade. That seems like a completely irrational decision, but it actually can be a rational decision if you play out all of the game theory. So that's definitely something, if people have more questions about that, we can put some links in the show notes about that whole decision-making process. This isn't completely in a bubble. There's been a lot of work done on why people make these sorts of decisions. So there's definitely a lot more research that people, if you're interested in looking into that, the whole game theory, we can post some articles on that. But Terry, using maybe some of that and what we've talked about so far, can you give us maybe a framework of the basis for Roman persecution? And we're really looking at this time period from the early part of the 1st century CE getting into the 300s. How should we look at that period of Roman persecution?
Absolutely. So we kind of started off talking about, you have the legendary view of, just nonstop state persecution for 300 years. We know that's false, and there's a somewhat less extreme view of 10 persecutions. That's not accurate either. But then you have the very skeptical view, which kind of goes too far the other way and overcorrects that. So what is kind of at a high level, the accurate grand sort of narrative, if you will, of Roman persecution of early Christians? So we've kind of talked about the basis. The main basis for Roman persecution doesn't really alter. It's Christians promote atheism. They are a threat to the peace of the gods. Unlike the Jews, who have antiquity, who kind of have a national deity in their land, which can kind of fit into our way we conceive of a global pantheon, if you will. Christians don't have a nation. They don't have a law. They're just everywhere, all over the place, and they are actively spreading their message and encouraging other people to be members of their group, which, from a Roman perspective, is subversive and detrimental to the well-being of society as a whole. So, so of course, the first persecution of Christians is famously under the Emperor Nero, where he scapegoats them in 64 for the Great Fire of Rome. But after that, it quickly escalates, and they are targeted just for their general attitude towards Roman religion and society. From that moment on, Nero doesn't decree any formal law. There's no need to, because every Roman citizen is going to agree that anything that threatens the Pax Deorum is something that should be suppressed. It's an unwritten law. There's no need to issue a formal decree. So for the next almost 2 centuries, Christianity is illegal, and it is subject to sporadic persecution. Christians are small, and so in some parts of the empire there are no Christians at all, and then other parts there are more so in the Greek East, and in the West it's mostly areas like Rome and North Africa. And so persecution is local, sporadic. It has a lot more to do with the local governor or the local population and their attitudes towards Christians. The emperors themselves are actually very rarely involved at this stage. Occasionally they will be, like with Pliny's correspondence with Trajan, as we mentioned earlier. The other part, though, that goes along with that, especially in the early centuries, 1st and 2nd century, not much is known generally about Christianity. So there is you see in a lot of texts, the accusations that Christians are cannibals or commit incest, which seem to be misunderstandings of the Eucharist and Christian terminology of themselves as brothers and sisters in the Lord. And that's partly why the apologists, figures like Justin Martyr and what have you, write the writings they do to educate their fellow citizens that Christians don't do these things, that the only thing they're actually killed for really is the Christian name. And that seems to pay off somewhat, because by the late 2nd and early 3rd century, we do see Christianity's public profile gain a bit of respectability. A a pagan philosopher named Celsus at the end of the 2nd century considers it worthy enough to actually write a full-length critique of. You and I did a previous collaboration episode on the early church father Origen of Alexandria, who his career is in the early 3rd century, and he famously had correspondence with a Roman imperial governor, with members of the imperial family, even wrote a letter to the Emperor Philip the Arabian. So you see Christians gain a certain measure of respect. It seems, and we start to see in the early 3rd century, the old slanders disappear, and when Christians are persecuted, it's just for the Christian name. And in some parts of the empire, there's relative peace and no persecutions, and other parts it happens more frequently. But that's an important transition difference between kind of 3rd and 2nd century Christianity is their kind of public respectability that they gain somewhat. Then, now, of course, in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire nearly falls apart. I'm sure both our listeners are aware. The crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire has a 50-year period of almost nonstop civil war. There's plague at one point. The empire even fractures into 3 empires at one point. And naturally, this is perceived by any traditionally minded Roman as the fact that the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, has been lost. Clearly, we are doing something wrong that has caused Jupiter and the gods to abandon us. So it is no surprise then in the mid-3rd century that we get for the first time, what can rightly be called imperial persecutions. Not necessarily the first time an emperor has been involved in persecution, but the first time we see central government policy concern itself with persecuting Christians. So in 250, the new emperor Decius issues an edict ordering all subjects of the Roman Empire, except Jews, to offer sacrifices to the gods on behalf of the emperor and the state. And it's his belief, naturally, that the central act of worshiping the gods, offering sacrifice, will restore the favor of the gods. Now, with Decius, it's interesting. Some have, how to phrase this, tried to sort of argue that he accidentally persecuted Christians, that his main goal was to restore the favor of the gods, and that persecuting Christians for not complying with his sacrificial edict, that was sort of, he didn't intend for that to happen. This, I think, is another case of affirming the obvious, but then going too far. It's definitely clear, they're definitely right, that Decius's main goal was absolutely to restore the favor of the gods. No question there. But given Christianity's public profile at the time, the idea that he was not aware that this was going to result in the persecution of Christians seems really hard to believe. And I think in his mind and in his government's mind, it would have been a natural corollary. Well, of course, we need to force the Christians back to the gods of their ancestors, because that's part of the problem. That's part of why the gods are upset with us, is because Christianity has spread. Not the only reason, but
yeah, they're a growing movement. Even though they're not a huge percentage of the population, they're a large enough minority to be noticed, right,
yes,
and be on the radar.
Especially in big cities like Rome and Carthage and Alexandria, where even though Christians at this point have somewhat expanded to the countryside, it's still mostly urban. And one of the first martyrs under Decius, as you're well aware, is Pope Fabian of Rome. Dies almost, I think within weeks of the edict. I think Decius issues his edict at the end of 249 or early 250, and Pope Fabian's martyred in January of 250. So when Decius is in the city, so it's definitely something they're aware of. Now, Decius famously or infamously, he and his son are the first emperors to ever be killed by foreigners. They die fighting the Goths in the Balkans the following year. And after that, things kind of go back to the status quo. Christianity is illegal, potentially subject to sporadic persecution, but the central government isn't actively doing that. So that when, for instance, a plague hits the famous Cyprian plague, named after Cyprian of Carthage, Bishop of Carthage during this time, he mentions that in his local area, a local provincial edict was issued to make people sacrifice to try to placate the gods to relieve the plague, and there was fear that this would result in a new outbreak of persecution. So And then we get, in the late 250s, the Emperor Valerian, who is initially positive in his attitude towards Christians, or at the very least, he doesn't seem antagonistic towards them. But then it seems that the empire in 257 just gets hit by on every front imaginable, and he and the Senate both decide to really go after and target Christians, and he issues 2 general laws against Christians, a less severe one in 257 and a more severe one in 258. And it's ultimately in this persecution that Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, is actually martyred. And then Valerian, like Decius, he suffers also an inglorious end. He's not killed by a foreign enemy, but he's actually worse from a Roman perspective. He's captured alive by the Persians, the Sassanids, the famous Persian king Shapur I. I'm sure many History of Rome fans will remember that as a very infamous episode in Roman history. It was kind of the low point of Rome's 3rd century history, that the emperor didn't even fall on his own sword. He actually got taken alive in battle.
And lived out the rest of his life as a prisoner.
Yeah. Which, of course, Christians at the time, they saw Decius and Valerian's fate as divine judgment, as we would kind of expect them to. Now, something very interesting happens next. So Valerian had co-ruled with his son Gallienus, and very shortly after Gallienus hears of his father's capture, he ends the persecution. Now, there is some debate over how far his actions went, because it is whatever Gallienus does sets off this 40-year period called I've called it the little piece of the church. You referred to it as the great piece of the church, but it's this very lengthy period where there really are no martyrs or persecutions, and Christianity just grows like wildfire in the empire. So some say that Gallienus, he didn't formally legalize Christianity, but he sort of did in all but name, because we know he actually let Christians have their property back that his father had confiscated. We even have a rescript from him to the Bishop of Alexandria saying, the people that are currently squatting in your churches, you can use my law to evict them and get your property back. I happen to think that he actually did formally legalize Christianity in the summer of 260. I think his recognition of their property rights is testament to that, because governments don't really recognize the property rights of illegal organizations. Now, that's neither here nor there, because the ultimate effect is still the same. But it's a very important moment. I really wish we had better sources for Gallienus. Unfortunately, most of what we have about him is just not very reliable. It'd be really nice to know what his motivations were in doing all this, but either way, it's a very crucial moment. And for the next 40 years or so, Christianity is not persecuted, and we don't hear really of martyrs. We hear of some what we might call conscientious objectors who refuse Roman service because they view it as incompatible with their Christianity. But they're martyred for their refusal, not necessarily because of their Christian faith. And Christianity grows. It grows in the countryside. It grows up all levels of the social ladder. The Emperor Diocletian, ironically enough, he appoints a Christian presbyter as he puts him in charge of the Imperial Purple Dye Factory in Tyre, in Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon, where they actually make the purple robes, or the dye for the purple robes of the emperors. There's Christian eunuchs in the Imperial Palace who are on good terms with the emperor. It's a very crucial time, very important time, but one that's not often well known about. It gets glossed over, especially by that kind of legendary view that this whole time period is just nonstop persecution. But you have a very long 40-year period where Christianity is really thriving.